Good evening. This is the final session of the biography of a city, Lawrence, a class taught at the University of Kansas. I'd like to express my appreciation to a number of important individuals who have helped us make this happen this semester. First, Dr. Barbara Watkins, who's been my comrade and worked with me side by side, has helped me grade all these papers and worked on a number of other issues that have been important to me. And then our three technicians, James Jewell, Nick Bartowski, and Scott McCrary, have, of course, been here night after night and have made sure that things go well. And then all our speakers who came, we had some 30 speakers throughout the semester from varied points of view and contexts, and I certainly appreciate that. All of you out there in television land, I would also like to hear from you. If you could write to me about this course, 206 Marvin Hall, the University of Kansas, Lawrence, 66045. I'd be glad to get your letters. And also, for those poets of you out there who would like to send me a poem about Lawrence, send it along. Also, your biographies, because if there is anything that I've learned this semester is how varied and multitudinous and interesting people are in Lawrence. So if you have a biography that you'd like to send my way, I'd be glad to have it. We have three speakers tonight and a number of students who are going to read poems about Lawrence. And so we want to get started right away. Our first speaker is Dr. Joe Harrington, who grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, received a BA in English, I presume, Joe, at Vanderbilt University, and a PhD at the University of California in Berkeley. He came to the University of Kansas as an assistant professor of English in 1995, where he now teaches American literature and American poetry. He's the author of numerous articles on modern poetry, American literature, and history. His dissertation topic, from which much of his discussion will come this evening, was titled American Poetry, a Political and Cultural History. Dr. Joe Harrington on Poetry Slams. Thanks for coming, Joe.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah. I should say that American Lit isn't the only thing that I teach. I'd like to go to the plug first. I'm teaching a graduate seminar next fall called Modernity and Globalization, in which we'll be reading not only poems but a lot of philosophy, political economy, and so on as well. Could we go to the Elmo on that little graphic? Yeah, there's the title and the graphic. So I'd encourage any grad students out there who might be in the audience or in the TV audience to consider enrolling and talk to me if you have any questions. Okay, I think we can switch back now. Thanks. Well, I want to thank Dennis for inviting me to be here. And when I was in the studio control room in the back, being wired up, as they say, one of the technicians said that he'd just written a poem to present for the open reading tonight. That's very much, it seems to me, in the spirit of a lot of the poetry slams that occurred in the early 90s in this country. The notion that anybody can write a poem, and moreover, the idea of spontaneity. That something's going to happen now, it's going to be exciting, nobody can control it, it's going to happen in front of your face, and you don't quite know what's going to happen. The other aspect of poetry slams that's interesting to me, if you read the segment from my manuscript, is that the notion of what Joyce Jenkins, the editor of Poetry Flash in the Bay Area, calls publishing with the voice. I was glad to see that the NEH is sponsoring us tonight, because Joyce attributes the rise of the poetry slams and open readings in the late 80s and early 90s to a decline in arts funding, specifically a decline for arts funding in poetry. Be that as it may, it's really clear that something happened in the late 80s and early 90s, that poetry, the popularity of poetry took off. And one of the reasons for this seems to be that people were together. One of the reasons and symptoms of this was that people were getting together in workshops, in open readings, in poetry slams, in reading groups, and sharing their poems and other people's poems. A lot of this I think we can kind of trace to the interest in value. You know, there's this whole narrative among sort of the baby boom demographic that, well, we were radicals in the 60s, and then in the 80s we're these materialistic drones, but now that we've got $200,000 in the bank, we've discovered that the real things in life that matter are spiritual values and substance. And I think to a large extent poetry represents substance for people. This has always been the case in the U.S., that it somehow represents spiritual values. It represents national identity. It represents that which is highest and most worthwhile in life. So people started embracing poetry both as a popular medium and as, I think, something that represented for them something that, say, the 80s lacked. People sort of moved back to poetry. The other aspect, too, of slams, and I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but the other aspect to recognize, just placing it within the history of U.S. poetry, is there's always been this real tension between the popular audiences for poetry and the elite audiences for poetry. This has been felt not only among the poets themselves, but also has been a continuous debate between critics and between readers over, well, is the avant-garde bringing something good into the art, or are they taking poetry away from the people by making it obscure, by making it elitist, by filling it with illusions and making it full of ambiguity when it should be direct and open, accessible, and speak to people. The notion that we get from the 19th century of poetry is that it's one person's heart speaking to another person's heart. And the notion is that poetry is the vehicle for that. Well, when modernism comes along in the avant-gardes of the 19 teens and 20s, you get the notion that the poem is an object. The one word that one of the major poets of the period used for this is autotelic, that it has a telos, a goal, that exists in itself and for itself. It's not designed to entertain, it's not designed to educate, it's not designed to inculcate values or edify you. There's no other end but itself. Well, in the post-war era, this is the view of poetry that became institutionalized within United States universities. And throughout, there was always this reaction on the part of people who said that this is not what poetry is supposed to be. Poetry is one of the things that helps society hold together and teaches people what's good and what's best. Insofar as it does that, and it's accessible, and it's widely published, and people grew up reading it, all of which was true in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was considered a popular medium, something that people had some kind of sense of ownership over. That, in fact, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, a lot of people wrote poetry. It was a very, very widespread practice. People published their poetry in their daily newspapers, in their church bulletins. They still do this to some extent. Not as widespread as it was back around the turn of the century, for instance. But the idea that the poetry slams were presenting, and still are, is the notion that this is still a going concern. This notion that poetry is for people and that people can write poetry, that it doesn't have to go through some kind of artistic or academic elite to be declared worthwhile or to be accessible, either in terms of the form of the text or in terms of being able to get it. Poetry slams were a way that poetry could be out there with the people, and that the people who were in the audience also tended to be the people who were the writers, and they also tended to be the judges. Let me just tell you a little bit about what a poetry slam is. First of all, they seem to have started, as far as I can tell, probably around between 89 and 91, somewhere in there, as a self-conscious means of promoting poetry, promoting the art of poetry. And I spoke with Gary Glazner, who's one of the people who organized these to begin with in Chicago, and he said as much. This was a PR gimmick. And the gimmick was, you advertised this event where you got people together. It might be in a bar, it might be in some kind of mall. And as people are coming in, you select, I don't know how they did it in Lawrence, but the ones that I've seen, they select judges as they come in the door. People from the audience. You don't know who's who. And then other people sign up to read. And so people come up and they read a poem, and then the 5 audience members randomly selected as judges will give them a score, like in the Olympics with the 3-4 or whatever. And so whoever has the most points at the end wins that session or that round, and then in fact there was national poetry slams. I don't even know if they still exist. Do they still exist? Yeah. So all these local poetry slams could send teams to the nationals, to the finals. Well, all this competition, all this notion of like reading poetry as a sport was really, again, it was just a gimmick. It was a way to get people in, to get them interested in the art, a way to poetry. And it's also what was happening at the same time that you had poet laureates like Rita Dove and Bob Hass, who were very actively promoting poetry in the United States along the same lines, the notion that it's a good thing to get poetry into the hands of the people. It very much goes against the grain of a lot of thinking of poets about themselves to a large extent. It has some precursors in, for instance, a thing called the Taos Poetry Circus, which I believe started in the late 70s, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. And there was that event. It still exists and culminates in a heavyweight read-off or poet-off, as it were, in which poets compete to be the heavyweight champion poet of America. Obviously, pretty tongue-in-cheek, just a way to generate excitement. Another is what was called the New Yorican Poets Cafe, and still is called that, in New York City, which started in the 60s, kind of faded away, and then came back, in which it was very performance-oriented. Poets would come together to not only read their work, but to perform their work. Underlying all this is the notion that poetry is something participatory and that it's something public. In other words, that it's not just like you're going and you're going to sit in your room alone reading a slender volume of poems or a academic poetry journal, but you're out there sharing poetry with other people, interacting with other people as you do it, and in many cases, having poetry be the catalyst for forming or reinforcing communities. And this is why a lot of people were and are interested in it. The notion that you can have poetry communities, and that this is a way, in essence, to let people not only share their feelings with each other and their creativity, but also in the process come together and have social relationships. Also, the other thing behind poetry slams is that the notion that excuse me, that poetry could be entertaining and not boring. People think of poetry and they think of like I did, having to recite "Stopping by Woods" on a snowy evening as punishment for having done something wrong. I was cutting up in class in 8th grade or something. And that's what people remember, and they remember dull. You go to a poetry reading, you have somebody up there who's excuse me, intoning their works, and you kind of drift off maybe. Well, poetry slams don't let you do that quite as much. There's much more use of the voice. There's much more use of body language. And what you end up coming up with is a kind of a hybrid art form. Not just poetry, not just your image of a poem on the page, but a combination of poetry, dramatic monologue, stand-up comedy, political rant, rap, and sport, obviously. There's this guiding sports metaphor. What it was an alternative to, and is an alternative to, is the notion of highbrow poetry, poetry for the few, that poetry belongs in the classroom, or that the publishing establishment determines who are poets and what poetry is. It's also an alternative to, or according to Gary Glazner, an alternative to the club scene, the late night music, drinking, pickup scene. It offered people a social venue that allowed them to get together and socialize without including those things, so that people who had kids could go to bed early, or who didn't drink could come and enjoy themselves. The other thing that it was an alternative to, or designed to be an alternative to, is mass media. Television, mass-marketed music, and especially to get past that notion of one-way communication, that you sit there and you watch and absorb and consume. With Poetry Slam, it's more two ways. You may be in the audience listening 1 minute, but you may also be judging actively and then you may be up there the next minute. Certainly in open readings, that's the way it works a lot. So it was an alternative to the mass media, and along with that, offered an art form to people that didn't require a lot of equipment, like amplifiers, or like, you know, what the art world calls bricks and mortar, like, you know, even oil and canvases, which cost a lot of money. As one of my informants said as I was doing research on workshops, poetry work Bay Area, she said, no matter how low you go, you can always afford a pencil and a piece of paper. So there's this notion that poetry is somehow more accessible in terms of being able to do it. And also what the slams were trying to do is promote a type of poetry that was accessible. You had to be able to communicate, or have to be able to communicate with your audience, and you get one take. You know, they can't go back and reread it. They can't ponder over the ambiguities and ironies of it. You've got to be able to communicate it. So it was really a mix of performance and poetry, not just one or the other. And people were judged on both the performance and the content of the poem. Okay. This is also happening, of course, however, ironically, given what I just said about the mass media, is happening at a time when poetry is becoming part of the mass media, too. So you have poetry on MTV. You have poetry videos becoming a new art form. You have, well, you know, it continues to this day. Matt Cook doing a performance poem for a Nike ad during the Olympics. So, you know, poetry is becoming more widespread in the mass media as well at the same time all this is happening. Now, the poetry slams, in essence, the way that you can read them based on what I've said is an effort to democratize poetry, this notion that poetry is a democratic art form, or can be, which again is an ongoing thing in the 20th century US, either that the avant-garde or that the professors are controlling poetry. Obviously, so The Wasteland, if you've ever, how many people have read The Wasteland? Okay, a few. How many of you have read anything by T.S. Eliot? Okay. So Eliot is sort of like the quintessential modernist poet, the one who's sort of the champion of the avant-garde in the US universities in the mid-20th century. Well, many people attacked Eliot for the very talked about as being obscurantist. In the 50s, you have what, in retrospect, was called the beat poetry phenomenon, which was sort of the antithesis of a lot of what I've just described. Very much an oral art form, a lot of it. In fact, one thing that people attribute to a poet like Allen Ginsberg, for instance, is a repopularization of poetry as an oral form. There's a famous poetry reading in, I believe, '56 in San Francisco, Gallery 6 reading, where you had like all these poets who got together and had this mass reading in a big crowd, passing around a bottle of red wine and various other things to kind of loosen up the audience. And it became a real participatory thing and a real performative thing. And in the same decade, poetry on record, on phonograph, which had been around since the 1920s, became a really big deal and started selling really well. Poetry readings were these big events where you had people like some of the beat poets, or Dylan Thomas, for instance, was really big in the 50s, a Welsh poet. So these became events. These became part of the social scene that young people engaged in. This is the tradition. And then the 60s, of course, you have poetry being read at political rallies, poetry festivals. This is the tradition that the slams are coming out of, this notion of a performative poetry that's a public poetry, that's a poetry oriented towards the audience and not just towards the poem itself and not just for poets themselves. Okay. So in the 90s, as I've suggested, you see this upsurge in workshops and open readings, especially on the coasts. The poetry slams, I think in a large part, when they started, were intended to create poetry scenes like the kinds that I've just described in the middle part of the country. And in a lot of places, they apparently, where you would have a town that did not have a poetry scene, that did not have a large audience for poetry or regular gatherings, the slam would be that scene. It would provide that for people. You can see the continuation of this not only in slams, but in people's interest in, for instance, cowboy poetry. You know, these big cowboy poetry festivals where the population of Elko, Nevada, will, swell by about 1,000% in a few days because of these people coming in for this festival. Well, a lot of this, I think, again, represents this notion that poetry is somehow more real, and that gets bound up with nostalgia. But there's also the sense that you can understand what they're saying, and it's got a rhythm to it, and it's entertaining, and it's funny, and people like to get together and listen to it. The poetry slams became hugely popular in the early 90s. They're less so now, perhaps, but there is still this wave of interest in poetry via new media, via new poetry communities. And if you had to sum it up, one way to think about it would be that this is an orientation towards poetry as a process and not just as a product. So it's not just those words on the page. It's not just the form of the poem, but it's how the poem's delivered. It's the medium that the poetry is delivered in, whether it's in person or TV. It's the quality of the performance. It's music, perhaps, in the background. All these other things start adding into it so that it becomes not just poems in the traditional sense that we're used to thinking about them, but something new, some kind of new art form that's constantly changing and evolving. And in the process, you have these real clashes in the notions of what poetry is and what poetry is for and what standards of judgment should be used to evaluate poetry, because that's a big part of the slams. You have winners and losers. Sometimes that also means a clash of cultures. A lot of the people who've participated and done well in the slams are African American poets. They are Latino and Latina poets for whom reading out loud, declaring who you are and how you feel becomes a political act as well. In fact, there's an anthology of the poets from the Nuyorican Cafe, who originally were mostly Puerto Rican writers, but since branched out. And the name of the anthology is Aloud. That like getting up there and saying it aloud has got a different political resonance than simply self-publishing poetry or publishing on a community press and having a smaller circle of people read it, or a literate circle of people read it. So that it has a different audience and a different resonance that can affirm your not only your creativity, but your very existence and your identity, especially since slam poetry primarily was designed to be brash, designed to be loud, was designed to connect with an audience in ways that you can't if you're just writing to the people who read poetry, which is a much, much smaller audience than people who are surrounded by poetry but don't know it, which is the majority of Americans who never open a book of poems, but who listen to rap music or who are surrounded by commercial jingles, or who pick up the New Yorker in the dentist office and read a poem there, or who are at a political rally and hear a poem there. These poems that filter through in and out of our daily lives every day. And that's one thing that slams, open readings, and so on were designed to bring your attention to. Anyway, so that's where I'll end it and hand it back to Dennis.
Thank you, Joe. Joe has given us the larger introduction to the Poetry Slam because, of course, Lawrence is very much a part of a larger culture. It doesn't exist on its own island. Jim McCrary, English poet himself, one of our Lawrencians for some time, will focus in on then the Poetry Slam in Lawrence, particularly the history of Lawrence poetry. He first visited Lawrence in 1964 and soon returned and has lived here on and off ever since. He left a rather dismal academic record at the University of Kansas, he says, but he's nevertheless published several books of poetry, and his poetry continues to appear in worldwide publications and anthologies, such as American Poets Say Goodbye to the 20th Century from Norton. He worked 8 years as office manager for William Burroughs Communications, and you've seen him before in this class in the panel on William Burroughs. Welcome back, Jim McCrary.
Well, let's see, if I could lay down on this, I could show the back of the shirt, but it's a Poetry Slam shirt. Has a poet, and it does have the sport motif. And I took it once with me on a trip to Honduras and had great fun. People would come up and, what's that? And end up talking about boxing. Okay, well, I'm going to show some overheads here, so I hope I'm not violating any rules of academia, but I think I'll start with this, which is my notes. And if I get confused in the next 25 minutes, that's why. But that's the spirit of the whole night, and I'm certainly into that. I do want to talk a little bit about, basing the whole remarks I'll make on why the slam happened, and more so why it was as successful as it was, and I'll come back to that. It was very successful in the time it lasted, standing room only at the venue, and I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. But why a slam in Lawrence, and why? And some of this you may have has been touched on before by other speakers, but and certainly I'm not an expert on the literary history of Lawrence, but I can talk a little generally about this. There's no question in my mind that the indigenous people, and I think you've heard some about them, the Kaw Indians or the Kansas Indians. I don't see how anybody could not sit on the top of where we are tonight on Mount Oread and not wax poetic about the Wakarusa Valley. And having seen some photographs of the Kansas Indians, they look like poets to me. They had kind of spiky hair, and they had schmatas in their heads, and they had their ears were ringed with earrings, and they were kind of wild-looking guys. They were sort of pirates on the Kansas River. They sort of beat up on the other people that came up and down the river. And that's, sort of like some of us have the romantic view of pirates and poets mixed up. So, and then and if you look to the history and literature of Lawrence, Walt Whitman visited Lawrence. And if you read in Leaves of Grass, there's a mention of the Kaw River, there's a mention of Mount Oread. Langston Hughes, of course, whether he wrote poetry while he lived in Lawrence, I don't know, but he certainly referred to it. Somebody told me the other day that Oscar Wilde performed at the old Liberty Hall or whatever it was when he was around one night. Back, if you read On the Road, mentions Kansas and his trips back and forth across the country. And that certainly was part of the deal of Lawrence always. It's in the middle. It was a place to cross through to get somewhere else. I just kind of mention these things as background quickly on the literary history that I know exists and why Lawrence has always had a sort of literary history. For my part, I came here, as Dennis said, in 1964. And when I came here, there certainly was this literary scene. There was a bookstore on Oread Street, which would be now across from the Alumni Center, called the Abington Bookstore, very small. There was a tavern there called Gaslight Tavern. You may have heard some of this from Wayne Propp talking about that. But it was a small bookstore dedicated only to what they called small press publications, poetry, prose, obscure journals, sort of in between the beatnik and the hippie scene. But it was there, and the owner published a journal, which I'll show some of you in a minute here. At the same time at KU, there was a man named Terrence Williams working in the library, special collections, who was a lover of poetry and started collecting so-called contemporary poets. And there's a wonderful collection of contemporary poetry in the KU special collections. And a man named Ed Greer in the English department, a professor who was writing a 12 or 14 volume Walt Whitman whatever collection, and a woman named Helen Moore, three people in concert with John Fowler, who owned the bookstore, were publishing poetry in Lawrence, and invited poets to read. And at this point, although I guess some people spoke about Lawrence, the town of Lawrence at the time anyway, and still when I came here in '64, downtown Lawrence was the agricultural center for Douglas County. You know, small shops, a bus station, some 3-2 beer joints, cafes, places where farmers going back and forth from the co-op hung out and killed time. There was a separation between KU and the city. There was one sort of funny coffee house, I think in the basement underneath, geez, I don't even know. It was called Abdul's, and it was like a beatnik coffee shop, and it was down on East 7th Street, maybe somewhere. But other than that, you know, downtown was not part of the literary scene, and barely part of the academic or the scene. It was separated. There was cheap rent. People would live up in lofts downtown, and that was part of it. But at the time in the mid-'60s, the concentration, the activity of literary and poetry more than anything was up here, was on the Hill. These people, Terry Williams and Ed Greer, other people invited, they had writers in residence, I'm sure they still do. When I came here, a man named David Ignato was a writer in residence, and this was in the 60s, mid-60s. He was from New York. He was known, very well known, sort of a academic poet, but he was also a radical poet. He was a radical from the old days and a war protester. And he invited some radical people here. He invited Ed Sanders and Tui Kupfenberg and a group called the Bugs, which was sort of a poetic rock group from the 60s. And a man named Jackson McClough, who was one of the most experimental writers of the time, while Ignato was writer in residence. So these people came here and read, and sort of that was the beginning of the politicalness of poetry in Lawrence, the anti-war things. And Allen Ginsberg came, and Robert Bly came, and Denise Levertov came at this time. And all the time publications were being made, were being printed. Lawrence was sort of on the circuit of radical campuses like Madison, Wisconsin, and Iowa City, and Austin, Texas, and this sort of Midwest haven, sort of a place to go if you were traveling. After David Ignato was writer in residence, a poet by the name of Ed Dorn was writer in residence in Lawrence, and he wrote one of the, to my mind, the finest book of poetry in contemporary America called Gunslinger, much of which he wrote while he lived at the Eldridge Hotel. And somewhere in his Gunslinger there's a line, and I quote, "The West begins at 701 Massachusetts Street." End of quote, and that's the Eldridge Hotel. And if you think about it, it was a day's ride, Santa Fe or Oregon Trail from Wyandotte, from Kansas City. The first day out, you crossed the Kansas River, and you were pretty much screwed from then on, you know. And he was part of that. And as I say, the Abington bookstore at this time, next to the Gaslight Tavern, which was over here across from the Alumni Center, was kind of a hangout. You could go in there and see George Kimball, the guy that ran for sheriff, drinking beer with basketball players. And it was just whoever was in there. It was everybody together. A woman named Lee Chapman then opened a bookstore down the street, which is now the Glass Onion. It was a bookstore opened by a guy named John Moritz called Tansy Bookstore, and then a woman named Lee Chapman opened a bookstore there. The Canterbury House on Louisiana Street, it's still there. They still do readings in the 60s in the basement, which was unfinished at the time. It was dirt floors, stone walls with some tables. It was a place called the Fiery Furnace. It was an ecumenical coffee house, and people celebrated the revolution there in the 60s. Reading poetry, Robert Creeley, Robert Duncan, some Ginsberg, Levertov, they all read there in the basement of this house over on Louisiana Street. And it goes on. So there's this history of certainly poetics in Lawrence, and I'll just show some graphics here. This publication called Grist. It was published at the Abington bookstore, and this is probably 64. And if I can zoom in on it cracks me up, the irony. This is was done on mimeograph. How many of you are familiar with what that is? You took a stencil, really, a blue kind of thing, and you typed on it with a typewriter, and when you typed, it had to be clean because the key went through the stencil. And here I am showing it on a Zoom thing, but this guy here, I don't know if you can see this, John Fowler owned a bookstore. Lee Chapman, as I said, still lives here and publishes a magazine. George Kimball, this fellow, ran for sheriff. I'm sure Props talked to you about George Kimball, right? Douglas County needs a two-fisted sheriff. Did he tell you that? Because the guy he ran against only had one hand. And George only had one eye. And the guy he ran against, whose name I can't remember now, was Rex Johnson. He said it was the only candidate he ever really enjoyed running against. This is a poem, Cosmology of Finding Your Spot, written by Edward Dorn. And it's about a dog that hung out at the bar down at the end of the street called the Rock Chalk Cafe. And that's the kind of things that were being published in Lawrence at that time. And this was it says, presented April 1969 at the United Christian Fellowship Benefit Reading for the Draft Resistors League. Right on. But typically at Lawrence, it's a famous poem. It's been anthologized. It's about a dog that hung out at a beer joint. You know. This is a magazine called Grist, and I'll have to probably driving these guys crazy back. It was published in the 60s. This is Lawrence Ferlinghetti at some hippie deal. I don't know what that is. But got a drawing with a cartoon, and it's an interesting magazine. Famous contributors, Allen Ginsberg's in this issue, Robert Creeley, Robert Duncan, Denise Levertop. Tansy, the bookstore I mentioned, used to publish little books that look like this. Little broadsides. They also published a magazine. This we've moved a little bit up from mimeograph, but not far. This is offset, I guess. I mentioned the woman, Lee Chapman, that owned the bookstore down the street in maybe 1970. This is the latest copy of her magazine she still publishes, called First Intensity, based in Lawrence, nationally distributed. Now we get into, there's an event called the River City Reunion. Took place in the late 70s, early 80s. 87, sorry. Mostly poets came, read. It was a two-day affair. William Burroughs, Jim Carroll, Andre Cordescu, Robert Creeley, Diane DePrima, Ed Dorn, Allen Ginsberg, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The drawing is by a guy named Steve Wilson, who used to model in this very building, maybe in this room in the 60s when it was Strong Hall. And there was always he never admitted to it, but most people look at that drawing and think of it as on the left is Ed Dorn, the cowboy poet, radical cowboy poet from Black Mountain, in a fight with Allen Ginsberg, the hippie poet with the sandals on the right. And maybe that's true, but they were both spent time in Lawrence, Kansas. So this is all leading up to the slam. And I've only got a couple of, you'll see more of this later. This is a poster from a slam. Obviously, must have been around Easter. And it's the three winners of the previous slam going into the final. And who will be reborn? And obviously, I'm not a historian or an archivist. I think I use this as a placemat. And here's a little, they can zoom in on it. I don't know if I can or not. It's a sticker for a slam, Grand Slam, May 11th. Okay, that's enough of the visuals. So why the slam? Well, as we can see, Lawrence was kind of set up for slams. There was always poetry events in Lawrence. There was always a reading series somewhere or another. and much of what Joe said certainly makes sense. And I think just to add that, to bring it down to a local level, why Lawrence, there was a population that wasn't afraid of poetry. Some of the radical people, when they had be-ins and all kinds of radical things down at Potter's Pond, or if they had demonstrations, poetry was a part of it. Poets were radicals. A lot of the radical poets, even more so than these people like John Sinclair, who went to jail, and other radical poets came here. It was part of that, so people were sort of used to it. But I think more so it was, Cheryl and I met, and she had been to the Nuyorican series in New York. I had been living in San Francisco where there were some slams. And we met and we talked and we said, well, what about a slam here? It'd be fun. And we, okay, the next question being where? And we looked around, and there were certainly, even that few years ago, not half as many venues. I mean, there was no replay, there was no jesters, there was no hijink, no whatever the other free state, there was no. But we looked around at Johnny's, at the Jazz House, and then in a fit of some struck by whatever, we thought about the Flamingo. And again, it's this part of Lawrence which has been there and known to people for years and for a lot of reasons. The topless bar that's always been there, owned by a man who always sort of had one, he lives, you know, he lives 10 feet in the, or his business is 10 feet in Douglas County. It's out of the city limits. But he's always sort of had his foot in Lawrence in one way or the other, you know, and always sort of there, never controversial. He never caused trouble. He never got busted. But he did things like when the city years ago outlawed drinking a beer at public softball places, he built 2 softball diamonds behind the Flamingo and said, come on out and you can drink beer. And for years, it still goes on today, but for years on Christmas Day, he had a free dinner, Christmas dinner, turkey dinner for anybody that wanted to come to the Flamingo, or they would deliver it. And he provided meals on Christmas Day for hundreds and hundreds of people, and there was a whole group of people, mostly from North Lawrence, that went and cooked these dinners, and it was a great thing that he did for the community. And he started the St. Patty's Day parade, and people were, at first the city wouldn't even let St. Patty's Day parade go down Massachusetts Street because it started at the Bird. It was sort of a pub crawl from the Bird to the jet lag. But as you know, today on Massachusetts Street, and Wes was the Grand Marshal a couple of years ago. So he's this guy that has this business, and somehow we got hooked up with him. We went out there and talked to him and told him what we wanted to do. Oh, he did one other thing, and this is community of Lawrence. He said he came to work one day, and he used to go there at 6 in the morning to get his stuff together, and he digs dirt during the day. But he saw 2 pickup trucks in the parking lot of the Flamingo, like at 7 in the morning. He thought, well, it's a couple of guys couldn't get home last night. But as it turned out, it was two farmers talking to one another out of the cabs of their trucks. And he went up and spoke to them and said, what's going on? He says, oh, we just come here, and they both had thermoses of coffee. So we just come here and drink coffee. There's no cafes left in Lawrence anymore. And he said, well, tell you what. And he took him around the back, took him in the back door, showed him the lot, showed him the lights, showed him everything, and gave him a key and says, you guys can hang out here and until 10 o'clock when the cook comes and the manager to open the business. And I guess there's, a dozen old boys that hang out there every morning for their coffee, because there really is no cafe anymore like there used to be. But that's kind of what Guy West is. And I think part of the reason why the slam did work and was so successful there is the sort of Lawrencean aura that we have here of this town, whether it's true or not that there's sort of an aura about Lawrence, going back to its founding or before, that a lot of people that came to the slam, certainly in the beginning to support the slam, somehow the bird attracted them. Whether they'd been there before, or maybe they always wanted to go there and couldn't, or didn't feel comfortable there because Topless Bar, at the time it was Topless Bar, now it's more than that. But it just worked out, and for us, the same thing, and we told Wes what we wanted to do. We want to have this poetry slam, and he kind of, yeah. And we said, well, these people get up and read poetry, and we do silly things, and he kind of went, yeah. And he said, well, okay, well, go ahead. I'm closed on Monday nights, so if you can get enough money to pay a bartender and a door guy and a waitress, go for it. And he didn't have any problems. And I don't know whether he really knew what we were talking about, and I don't know if we did, but we had this idea, and we went ahead, and it worked wonderfully. And he provided, the space was big, there was a stage, there were great lights, there was great sound already in place, it was comfortable, there were tables around, chairs with wheels on them for obvious reasons. But people could come sit around a table with people of like not many bars. It just worked. There was carpet on the floor, a wonderful bar, friendly people. But just the sort of thing where it was a comfortable place, people could gather around a big table, pull up all their chairs, talk with their friends, move around, listen when they wanted to, participate if they wanted to be a judge. And like I say, it had all we couldn't have found a better place. But part of it too is that sort of aura of Lawrence. It was in North Lawrence for another reason. So we were starting sort of a new event, something a little different, something a little radical. Not only was it at a funny place, North Lawrence. And I think all through this thing you have to remember the geography of Lawrence. The hill, the downtown, and then North Lawrence, which certainly has had a much different flavor to it. It's changed over the years, but certainly the farther back you go, the different flavors of parts of town, we're kind of becoming all the same now. But I think that all contributed to that. And then we were fortunate enough to have people in town willing to do this thing, sort of experience. And not only that, we were fortunate enough in the end to find out there were all these people willing to participate. Not everybody, and I'm sure Cheryl will touch on that a little bit. Not everybody liked the idea. Funny though, I think we got more resistance about the fact that it was a poetry slam, a competition. Poetry shouldn't be competitive. Poetry shouldn't be noisy. Than we did about where it was being held. People got over that pretty quick. But all this sort of lends into the feeling of this particular thing called Poetry Slam we're trying to talk about tonight. And why I think it was a thing whose time, the right place, with the right people, and it worked wonderfully. And I think that's one of the things about Lawrence. It's always been part, and I'm sure if you think back about this whole course, that you might have heard that sort of thing before, the right place, the right time, the right people, and it kind of keeps happening that way. Obviously, yeah. Because I got such weird glasses, I can't see here. River City, and so that was the slam, and it's done, and now, you know, Jesters. There's some poetry things going on at Jesters, downtown 24-hour place. Canterbury House over here. The Raven bookstore occasionally. Another place there at 7th in New Hampshire, I don't know if they have poetry or not, do they? Some chain bookstore, I don't think that one. I don't know, maybe they do. But it's still, and it's always going to happen. It will come and it'll go. The slam, we started out at the Bird. We moved to the Jazz House. And two things changed. One, you had to be 21 to go to the Bird. Or 21 at the Jazz House. I don't know what that, we hoped, part of the reason of going there was hoping to draw high school or younger people, and I don't know. The real reason I don't think it worked is because the chairs at the Jazz House are nailed down. That's my feeling. Everything else given. But again, it was just, it had taken its time. We'd done it. We'd had it. It worked. And then it still goes on like Joe said, there's hundreds of poetry slams around the world. And they have an international now poetry slam off. But it happened here and it doesn't happen anymore. And that's sort of the way of Lawrence too. Things come and go pretty fast here and then continue on. But there's still a lot of poetry stuff going on in Lawrence, and there's no question in my mind it'll continue. I see now that the balance between KU and the community of downtown Lawrence has become more even. I don't know why that is, but to me it's good that you don't have to climb up the hill like Joe was saying metaphorically, you know, climb up the hill to find poetry in some tomb at the top of a hill in a very quiet place. You can go down to Jester's and there might be some guy going off, you know, and that's the spirit of it, and it's the spirit of Lawrence, you know, and maybe it'll come back, maybe not. But while it was here, it was the top thing. We were, you know, they had the best of Lawrence, and we won. What was it, Cheryl? The best first date, the best place to go on a first date one year. We won that poetry slam, Flamingo, and you know they had that best of Lawrence deal. And what, you know, how can you do better than that? You know, you can't. Anyway, that's it. That's the best I can do, and I think I'm pretty close to my time, so hopefully won't screw things up too much if I exit.
Our next speaker is Professor Cheryl Lester, who grew up in Detroit, where she lived through the tumult of the 1960s. And she went on to the University of Michigan, where she earned her BA in English in the early 1970s. She then left for Southern California just as the bottom was falling out of the auto industry, and she received an MA in comparative literature at USC. She then back to the northeast, to SUNY Buffalo, which by that time had become a rust belt. After receiving her PhD in English and comparative lit at SUNY Buffalo, she moved to Lawrence, where she's taught American literature and culture at KU. She's finishing a book today on William Faulkner and the African American migration, and is preparing to go to Senegal this June to collect women's oral narratives about migration. She will continue the discussion about the poetry slams in Lawrence. Welcome, Cheryl.
This is the first time I've ever been in this room. I've been teaching here at the University of Kansas for 10 years, and I've never taught to a TV before. And so this is unique, and I'm not sure I like it. One of the reasons I think I was interested in co-producing a slam in Lawrence was to transform the environment I was finding myself in all the time, every day. My office is in Wesco. My classes, certainly those years, were almost entirely in Wesco and in Fraser. As most of you know, there are lots of rooms with no windows in Wesco, including my office. Lots of classrooms that are very dimly lit. And that sort of classroom situation can be very constricting. We all know that lots of magical things can happen in a classroom, but talk about lots of dull. There can be lots of dull. And so it's very fun myself in this room talking about the poetry slam, which was supposed to be sort of an antidote to the situation that we're finding ourselves in right here. When I found out that Dennis Domer was going to be teaching this class, I was as delighted as just about everybody else. It's so important to try to figure out what we, as the University of Kansas and Lawrence, have to do with one another, and to continue to explore what our relationships and our responsibilities to one another are. And this is so important. A representation of the fact that some of that thinking is going on, I guess, more publicly. There are lots of ways, obviously, in which relationships are carried on that are very important all the time and that have been since the University of Kansas was founded. I myself, however, teach in the English department. And traditionally, which is to say at least since World War II, what we've done is isolated texts. I don't even have a book up here. And made everyone else get their hands on that text one way or another, and used that text to orient our conversation, our study, our investigation, which is a pretty narrow focus. Around the 60s, those tumultuous 60s that Dennis referred to when I lived in Detroit, that idea of how to organize learning, even in the study of English, even in the study of what we understood to be, really changed. And some of our ideas about what education, and especially higher education, are supposed to be about changed. For me, as a professor at the University of Kansas, wanting to start something like the Poetry Slam had something to do with with that history and with my experience, having been here already for about 4 years as a professor. In preparation for tonight, I, with a lot of dread, began thinking about all those tapes that I have of, alas, not as many slams as I wish, but all those, what amounted to finally 9 or 10 tapes that I have from the 3 years, from 1991 to 1994, that Jim McCrary and I, with a whole lot of help from other people, produced the Poetry Slam, 10 tapes. And they'd been sitting around, and I don't think I'd watched 1 minute of one of those tapes. And that's interesting in itself. And we were very jealous of those tapes. Lots of people wanted to have copies, or they wanted the tapes. In fact, I must say, Wayne, props, I hope you're watching this right now, because you know you have one. And I know it's a good one, and I've never seen a moment of it. But we were mean in refusing to give people the tape. And we decided someday we'd figure out something important to do with these tapes, and that we didn't want to get in the business of reproducing videos. We had our hands full as it was. And so I really felt this was the time I needed to pull those 10 tapes off of the dusty shelves they sat on and do something with them. And so given the excitement and the opportunities of being at the University of Kansas and in Lawrence, it was possible for me to find other people who were willing to share their resources and their expertise and make a document about the Poetry Slam. And given however many hours it took to go through these tapes and try to pick out not only reasonably representative segments, fun, interesting, you'll have to judge for yourself, but also, as it turned out, segments that hadn't been degraded or destroyed, therefore weren't usable. Turned out a lot of that has already been the case, and we're only talking about tapes that are from somewhere to 5 to 7 years old. Some of them weren't usable, some parts of them weren't usable. But we were able to shoot some new footage and to use some of the documents from the Slam tapes. And this was my first experience at creating a video. I was happy and fortunate to be a part of it, and I used this occasion, like we all use assignments, to get something done that I never would have done otherwise. So we're going to show this 13-minute video, which will give you a much better idea, I think, than our words have been able to so far of what the Slam was like. So could you please roll it?
VR.
Like GT?
7.5 from
7.5.
7.5.
And another 7.5. Okay? That leaves Bill.
Don't talk about anyone related to you whatsoever. Read about stupid farm people named Mary Louise Jane and Chicken Neck Tommy. Tell how they have sex while watching political commentary on their brand new TV. Ask what each word for each sex act really means, especially whipped cream and tangerine are involved. Ask to slam against someone you like. So
In 1991, I had a great summer. I went with 12 university students on a summer abroad exchange from Kansas to New York. It was a student who went to the East Village one night to the Nuyorican Cafe, which is one of the first places to have originated a poetry slam. It's in a very funky neighborhood, and it was started by a group of poets who are Puerto Rican New Yorkers.
ESPN announced that there was a poetry slam going on at the Flamingo. So we have reached that far and wide into the neural nets of the logosphere of the globe.
I dreamed I slept with JFK. All the brothers were there. Bobby and Jack and Joe. Wait, Joe wasn't there. That's right, Joe wasn't there. Joe died before they invented TV. I was in a gymnasium putting on a show. I was dancing and singing two things I don't do. And there they were laughing and lounging on bleachers, stretching their legs, oh so long, their legs. Their smiles were easy, and I thought to myself, they look like they could be on the pier at Hyannis. They passed a bottle, a green one, real tall, full of ripened and aged Irish whiskey. They clapped when I bowed, then loosened their ties, slick moves by some rich boys from Boston. He approached me backstage with his brothers in tow, and they smiled again and looked pleased. He leaned over and dropped in my ear a quick whisper. It was wet, so was I. He said the champagne's very dry in my car. We got in the car, of course shiny and black, and Bobby and Ted got in theirs, and they waved out the back window at their big older brother as he asked, "Have you ever played touch football?" I unzipped my skirt in a car that was dark, but the moon, a round fat one, could see, and so could JF as he puffed a cigar while my breasts rose and fell in this dream. If you can't tell by now, this dream was all, well, a sweaty one, born in my groin. I thought when I woke, oh Jack, let's do it again. This must be the American dream, my first time in an American dream.
It was funny trying to make this happen in Lawrence. I just started calling around and speaking to bar owners and asking if they would be interested in having something like this take place. And so that, of course, meant I had to try to explain what it was. First of all, most people weren't interested, and they thought, you know, this was just not going to draw enough people. I can't understand why I would want to have poetry readings in my bar. Paul Lim suggested The Bird, which I'd never heard of. It's a topless dancer bar on the north side of town. Jim McCrary and I got together with the owner of the Flamingo, Wes, and he said, hell, I'll try anything once. There would be 3 rounds, and on the first round, each of 3 poets, generally 3 poets, would read 3 poems. After each person read their 3 poems, the MC, either Tony Allard or Frank Doden, in our case, would go walking around the room to each table of judges that sort of patter with them, but in the end they had to come up with a number, quantitatively judging that person's performance. And then that number would be recorded by scorekeepers. And then the second poet in the first round would come up and read 3 poems, and so forth. Then the slam would be over, the scores would be compiled, someone would be named a winner, and that person would come back at the end of the season and participate in the Grand Slam.
And the rules of tonight's game are that we have now 6 people. We will go 2-2-1. In other words, the first round.
He took it really badly, and I don't understand why, because this is love and passion, and the name of this poem is Sometimes I Just Want to Stab You in the Heart. And he took it badly. I don't know what the fuck he was thinking, but he didn't see, he didn't see the butterflies.
Work it, girl, work it.
So this one is called Sometimes I Just Want to Stab You in the Heart. Sometimes I just want to stab you in the heart. Sometimes. Only sometimes. I mean, not like every day. Okay, so maybe it occurs to me every day. And it sounds like a good idea for a minute or 2. But it's not like I dwell on it. And even if I did it, I'm sure I'd feel bad. Later. Yeah, baby. Sometimes I just want to stab you in the heart, swinging wild like a girl. Now, I'd probably miss and hit your chin, but it's the thought that counts.
I think people really loved seeing one another in very different roles, sort of upsetting typical hierarchies, almost like a masked ball, or a carnival, with people really seeing their own opportunities for behavior and speech very differently, and seeing other people express themselves differently or represent themselves differently.
It's called Square Dance.
Grab your partner, walk her down the aisle, make your vows and keep for a while. Break your vows and take off the ring, file the papers, everybody sing. Alimony left and alimony right, child support and custody fight. You get the house and I get the rest, pay your lawyer, get depressed. Promenade. Form a support group. Lose some weight and buy some clothes, sleep around and spin your dough. Everybody go to town, pick a new partner and settle down. Grab your partner, walk her down the aisle, make your vows and keep for a while. Break your vows and take off the ring, file the papers, everybody sing. Alimony left and alimony right, child support and custody fight. You get the house and I get the rest, pay your lawyer, get depressed.
And this happened not only in terms of who got up and on stage and did something, but what people were doing in the audience. There was a lot of time in the Poetry Slam, there is a lot of time in Poetry Slams where it's the audience really that is the event, not the poet.
Listen to four?
Any other hipsters out there? Lipsters? Hipster lipsters? Good.
All right. When my cat saw the fish stick his head up out of the fish bowl, he began to purr. Oh, how tasty that fish would be, incorporated into my meow mix.
Our Poetry Slam lasted for about 3 years, and by the time it was over, we pretty much think, we'd used everyone up.
The sun is up, and the phone begins to ring, and Julia comes to crawl into my lap, to insist upon her comfort, to begin to pull my chain. She knows she was inside of me, and I tell her, you used to eat what I ate and drink what I drank. But now that you are out, can we let him be the mother? Can I?
A 10 was the very best you could get, and I don't think anyone ever gave it. So I think 1 was really pretty horrible, but even if you were at a 5, that was a pretty bad score. And so mediocre, 7 was really mediocre.
5 tables of judges as usual. This is our first table of judges. And what are you calling yourselves tonight?
We're the Mushroom Press.
The Mushroom Press. What'd you think of Cheryl's poetry? What kind of score do you? I'll get it from over here.
7.
A 7 from the Mushroom Press. Oh, there's other judges. Ooh, they're not going to make it out of the parking lot. Got some people back here. A whole slew of judges.
I'm so happy I'm not in a mental institution.
Have you ever been there long enough?
All right, we have it down from the gods above. These are the folks. These are the slammers. These are the hook-it-outers. These are the bards that will be continuing.
Okay, we now continue the hour with the Poetry Slam by students and others going to give their poems about Lawrence.
Brian Saylor, Human. This is a poem, not really so much about Lawrence, but a friend that I made in Lawrence before he moved on. And he had created this sort of character named Poofy. And it's something I still will entertain friends with. So here it is, Poof. He rises. Thank you. He rises as moist as a velvet job, eyes wide open yet closed to the world. He screams with joy and sometimes pain. Champagne was born for sex, and he's had a few. He's like an invisible friend, but not. He's brilliant when he shines, which isn't often, but when he does, look out. His friend is his coffee belly, and a broken promise is a delicious dream. For Poofy is neither man nor beast, but that place in your mind that won't let you sleep. You know that place where wooden bikes are sold by the pound and faucets always make that dripping sound? If one listens to him frantically scowl, one would try to shut him out. But when he does it again, it seems to make more sense. So if you hear him claw on your door, just give him some mop water, then go watch some TV. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll get your,
Yeah, sure.
thank you. Oh, you have to put your name on it, right?
Okay. My name's Alexis Rediel, and mine's not quite that humorous, and I don't have any props, but this is called What Lawrence Means to Me. Lawrence has a complex history. Founded with the cry for freedom and liberty, Lawrence has grown with an enormous pace, and the little town blossomed with grace. From crude tents and muddy roads came different people with common goals. With almost nothing to their name, people came, and some left, who went on to great fame. From exodusters, fugitives, and army men too, rose a people who each had a different view. New Englanders, Germans, and pioneers all would need to have good cheer. After some rough and turbulent times, Lawrence became a fascinating find. With the University of Kansas up on the hill came many young people seeking a thrill. As the 20th century quickly closes, Lawrence has had many poses. Surviving a depression, cars, protests, and wars, Lawrence has sometimes been more concerned with basketball scores. Lawrence projects many personalities. Understanding them can have its difficulties. But with all of its complexities, I have views of simplicity of what Lawrence means to me. Thank you.
About Lawrence. L. Langston Hughes, his verse on the City Hall. We have tomorrow bright before us like a fame. A. All things are connected, Haskell's response to the South Lawrence trafficway. W. William Burroughs makes Lawrence his home after gaining worldwide fame. R. Rock Chalk Jayhawk, go K. E. Electricity produced by the Kaw River by the Bowersock Dam. N. Naismith James, the creator of basketball, coaching at KU. C. Childcare and women's rights, brought to the limelight by the February Sisters. E. Everyone, no matter how their opinions differ, there is agreement. This is not Ottawa.
I remember I saw it.
Hi, my name's Jill Gardberg. I'm not going to title this. The ageless man wanders the brick-paved roads and well-groomed streets of Lawrence. His ill-fitting red sweatpants match his red T-shirt, printed with some witty saying like human target. He pauses curbside and tilts his head upwards, eyes wide open, staring towards the skies with thick black frames. He mutters, seemingly incoherently, a private conversation yet public all the same. Passers-by cross to the other side of the street. Others jeer at what they don't take the time to understand. Years pass, and still today, the ageless man wanders the streets of Lawrence.
Hi, my name is Rhonda Ovaldo, and my poem's titled The Test. It's ironic when you admire me at a powwow. Take a couple of pictures, I can feel the respect. But as soon as I walk into your precious Mass Street store, you have no respect watching my every move. You only see a bad Indian. What happened to the person who wanted to know my name? The person who put me in their family album? They have been engulfed by a stranger. The next year you see me again and ask to take my picture. No, I reply, not until you see me as a person. And you wonder what I mean. As I wonder, will you pass the test again?
I'm Greg Getzoff. Had the fortune of living in East Lawrence when I lived here. And this is about when I would run through the streets. I ran the streets of East Lawrence. In the cool evenings of fall, I would run them all. 14th in New Jersey was where I always began. Brick peered through broken asphalt on New Hampshire. It always broke my stride. North I would go until I hit that crummy mall. Where the hell did this bookstore come from? East I headed until the Santa Fe began. South to the sounds of black men playing checkers in a dusty lot. Meandering to the east, I found a detail shop. Back home again, brought the children on the corner to cheer, "Run, Forrest, run."
Hi, my name's Noel, and this is a running poem too. I recently returned from exile in New England. This is Returning, a Lawrence Run. Geez, only 7:30 and already 85. Take extra water. August is nice, especially with the students gone. Birds Union, Jayhawk Towers, halfway up the hill, 1 mile at 9:05. Better slow down or this heat will kill me. West Campus, new buildings. All right, 15th Street, go west. Golfers, and they think that's exercise. Nice little hill, kind of steep. Okay, let's cruise, automatic kicked in. A concrete house, very interesting. It must be an artist. Nice view of the pond from the kitchen, I bet. Oh man, I've never been out here before. 4 lanes. The bank clock, 8:04 and still 85. Hey buddy, you wait for me. Golf Course Superintendent's Association? Too much. Nice stone office buildings. I'd like a house like that one. Road closed. Good, I get the white line. Check out those houses on the way back. Why do they cut down all the trees around the house? They wouldn't do that in New Hampshire. Too many ridges and valleys. Rat carpenters. The roof's gonna leak. If only the buyers knew. Clinton Parkway to the dam. This is a nice hill. Flow. An underpass. Must be the West Lawrence traffic way for the developers. Used to be a nice farm there, it looks like. The dam. It's getting hot. Water is going to be. I wonder where that path goes. From here, Lawrence looks just like Lenexa. Lenexa has better hills, but Lawrence is friendlier. Go back and do 15th Street again for the way back, not Clinton. A lot of traffic at Casold. Church must be out. Hit it, I got the light. Almost home, 23 minutes, no water. Killer little hill up the West Campus. Up here by Hash Hall, the campus view somewhat reminds me of Brandeis from this angle. Let's go, pull out easy now, 7 minutes. Allen Fieldhouse. I remember Cher, James Taylor, Elton John. Who's that a statue of? Catch him later. Excellent timing. I got the light. Okay, hold on, there's the finish. Not bad, 22 and 3:35:15. Glad to be back.
My name's Tyler White. This isn't exactly about Lawrence, but maybe my own piece of local history from last summer. It's a sestina I wrote entitled Upon Meeting in Lawrence, July 5th, 1997. Only 3 days before a legal drink, my roommate, your friend, placed you before my eyes. I remember the song echoing through the room, whispered by morphine. You were gorgeous but not dressed in blue, inspiring a mass of feelings that grew, perhaps beyond what any scale could bear. I remember thinking you were someone I would happily have held. As the evening progressed, a forum was held within a singular mind, deciding after food and drink, where gone and the table and counter had developed a scale of margarita spills and cigarette smoke, which stung our eyes. You would be shown the bar at which mass was held with martinis and cigars, our escape, our numbing, our morphine. The conversation was the best since Sandman and morphine had gathered around the fallen cherry, where lies are told and held quorum, talking of Boston, yet ending on mass. You claimed a snake bite was your new drink. Its darkness evoked the luster shine in your eyes, which hypnotized and caused me to shed my own venerable skin of scale. As the 2-ounce pours began to tip the scale between lucent thoughts and the nebulous babble of morphine, induced crazed, we strained to connect glazed eyes in gaze. A wish fulfilled, our visions held. In rapture, a smirk arose as, "Can I buy you a drink?" was spoken far past its prime, and we unfurled into an uproarious mass. Wondering if Granada equates to passion fruit walking off mass, in the darkness appeared a ladder to scale. We should become the show was smiled as you set aside your drink. Aqueous movements and dips as drips of morphine. Stelliform beats which mold and meld the grasp I held. You tight within, an opening of smiles and closing of eyes. The sun was rising and the drooping of eyes became heavier as friends lay in slumbering mass. I rolled into the hammock, for in my belt was held she whose beauty grew as a crescendo on its scale. Laying suspended with my emotions, I listened to morphine. On the radio, Sandman belching tunes about the drink. Waking with the sun in my eyes, I brushed away the slumbering scale. Church bells echoing from the mass, throngs having gathered for their daily morphine. Once more before leaving you were held, but goodbye was not in your eyes.
My name's Jason Schreiner. I'm an American Studies student hoping to graduate in the next 3 weeks. There's nothing in my throat, effect. I just scratched this down about 5 minutes ago because I love to do things like this, and so it's untitled. This is a very short tale about how things aren't so swell. It's about downtown, the city's jewel, and about some people who've been a little cruel. You see, they're raising it down. For growth, they say, it's another round. Oh yes, people tried to stop it, but the big guys had a fit. So why did the community splinter? Well, 'twas a hard, cold winter. But don't let my tale frighten you away. Go downtown every night and every day. Spend money, time, all your energy. It's important to maintain its synergy. But, my friends, remember this cautionary tale. Just because it looks good doesn't mean all's well.
Okay, I'm Nick Bartkowski. I'm a junior in English and journalism, and I'm also one of the crew that helps put together this show on each and every week. And so this is kind of a poem about sitting back there trying to get everything working while you guys are up here just enjoying. And I call it Ode from the Control Room. I sit in my director's chair. The Open has just run. Now Dennis's movement reminds me why I should buy a gun. Back and forth and back and forth and side to side again. Stand still, I shout, but still he moves. Some days I just can't win. The presenter starts, Dennis is done, his dance is at the end, which is good because if he moved once more, my hair from my head I would rend. The show goes on with killer shots. My directing is at the top. Except for the time I cut to naked people, an image provided by W Prop. We get to the end, give them a sign. 10 minutes, get Dennis to see. We wait, and the show runs long because no one understands 30. 2 minutes, minute and a half is what people take when the 30-second sign we show. Our show should run an hour, but we turn in 1:10, so off the air it does go. I finish each show totally worried that age 20, my career is trashed. But the course is over, so forget about it. So off to Free State to get smashed.
I have 2 poems, one from a friend of mine, Dick Holland from Austin, Texas, who often visits Lawrence, and I read this for him in absentia, titled, The Life of the Mind, for Shirley. So much depends upon a cold vodka martini up on Mass Avenue at week's end. Paradise. Now my own that is quite a different type, entitled The Caw. I am the Caw, your historian. Watchful day and night I tell your story, flowing with no beginning, no end, like time out of a bottle. I murmur and surge along, writing you down, critiquing and commenting, and counting your stock of the future. 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 4 is 16. Time adds up. I am the river. Ages and ages and ages again, when prairies bent the wind, I wrote clear and clean. You were mine, and I was yours. You drank me, fed from me, nested in me all your days. You lived, you loved, you died. You took what was given, took what was taken, gave thanks for sacred water. Then, O pioneers, you laid bare the land, you crossed and double-crossed me. You conquered or tried to. You built your city right on the bend, you fools. Sarkovsky, chief of the Delaware, told you in 44 I swept the place clean. In my time, not your time, you'll get yours in 1903. Who said build those bridges? Who said build that dam? Who said build that railroad on my banks? Take them away, way down, where my mother wants them, her mother too, and the mother of mother wants your houses and your homes and your dollars and cents. Where Sarkovsky warned you not to stay, you stayed. Try me. Try me. Try me again. I'll give you 51. Try me. Try me again, you slow learners. Take 93 and 95, 5-year floods in 3 years. Ha! You barely held on. Just wait. Just wait, you fools. Dredge me. Pour in your chemicals. Dump in your shit and shinola. I'll kick your asses when you think you've won. I'll make you pump and pump and pump, and then take your dikes down, crumbling down. Swill of my waters, you made it drink it. Swallow whole globs of gunk you made, then puke out your guts and say what happened. Give me your living and give me your dead. You made what you made, your poison is mine. Drink up like cold beer at Johnny's. I am the Kaw, historian of your ways. Sarkovsky knew me. You don't know me. You don't know me. Your time is not my time. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 16 is 52. 256 times 256 is 65,536. You don't know me. I take no prisoners. Well, we have a short period of time left in the class. We wanted to take a look back at Lawrence and particularly this class, and I've asked Professor Tuttle and Professor Schultz to look at this class with me, and I hope the class out there will also participate and enjoy these last few minutes together. I wanted to first turn to Bill Tuttle here on my left to ask him to review the issue of local history and why it's important.
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, Dennis asked me to say a few words about local history and its importance to our understanding of our national history. In other words, I think what he wanted to know is what can we learn from local history. I want to explain one thing, and that is that the writing of history has changed tremendously over the last 30 years. During the period right after World War II, from the period of around 1946 and the beginning of the Cold War until the mid-1960s, during the years of McCarthyism and political conformity, the story of the U.S. was quite a simple one, and it was a profoundly conservative story. I think this narrative of the United States went something like this, that the United States had evolved through pragmatism and non-ideological pursuits and peaceful social change, and also through capitalism, that the U.S. had become the greatest nation in the world, and that the Americans had changed when they needed to, but it had been consensual, it had been peaceful, and also there was a lot of talk during this Cold War period in democracy about American political institutions and political philosophy. It was quite a self-congratulatory view, I think, of the United States, that all Americans believed in such concepts as majority rule and representative government, that we all enjoyed the vote, and we could determine our future by using this free and open voting process, and that Americans thus enjoyed political self-determination. A lot of people talked also about the American dream during these years, that the American people enjoyed not only political self-determination, but also social justice, also upward mobility if we were willing to work hard enough and take advantage of our free public schools. Also, I think a sense that the United States was a melting pot. We'd all melted together. We'd all become assimilated, acculturated. We were all Americans. This was, as I said, a conservative United States. It was one in which historians especially, I think, but most Americans focused not on local history, but focused on great white men. Local history, I think, during these years was thought to be an unfit subject of study. And I think historians were utterly disdainful of the subject that they thought should be studied, not by great people like themselves, but by antiquarians, by genealogists. Their interest was in studying not local history, but great white men. So during this period, let's say from 1945 to the mid-1960s, historians studied presidents, they studied generals, robber barons, military officers, Supreme Court justices, highbrow writers. They also believed that during this period, Americans should avoid political passion, that political passion had produced Nazism and McCarthyism, so people should try to political trouble, not become passionate about their beliefs. And also, I think, finally, during this period, scholars believed that Americans should trust their leaders. This was a time when leaders had credibility, so they should trust the leaders in political life, the leaders in religious life, in education, in the military, in business and labor. I think the argument during this period was that anyone who found fault with the United States was a sorehead, probably had psychological problems. So when historians studied things like the abolitionist movement, they looked not at slavery as the problem, they looked at the abolitionists as the problem, as irrational people who couldn't fit in, who were constantly causing trouble. This was also, I think, the historical view of the populists, of the progressives, of other people who tried to bring change to the United States. Now, this is a far different world we live in today. As we drive around town and see bumpers that say, question authority, I think we can appreciate how different those years after World War II were. The family slogans of that time were family togetherness, the family that prays together, stays together, and not much about questioning authority. And what changed all of this, I think, first of all, was the civil rights movement. And you've learned a lot, I think, in this class about the civil rights movement and about race relations in Lawrence. But what really began to change that attitude, I think, the Cold War attitude of the post-war period, was the civil rights movement, beginning with the Brown decision in 1954, and really bursting upon the scene in 1960 with the first of the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. Following the civil rights movement, with its moral outrage and its commitment to direct action, were other movements for student rights, for peace in Vietnam, for women's equality, and for full citizenship rights for all Americans. So instead of the top-down history that we'd had after the war, we began to have bottom-up history. History from the bottom up focuses on the lives of ordinary people, on America's plain folk, on the communities they have created. It studies families, it studies neighborhoods, and it studies towns such as Lawrence. In other words, it studies local history. So local history, when it's really done well, I think as it has been done in this class, helps us to understand ourselves in new ways. It's important. People began to believe that social history had an importance that far exceeded mere antiquarian interests or genealogical interests, a kind of history that transcended the puff pieces that you might get about local history from the Chamber of Commerce or the local newspaper or other local community boosters. Community history or local history is no longer a history of local elites, written by local elites. I think it's fair to say that local history in more recent years has become a tool for empowering people and their communities. There were many scholars, I think, who clung to the great white man school of historiography. There were scholars who said, let's not study the community, but they were, I think, eclipsed in the 1960s and beyond. The course offered by Dennis Domer on Lawrence exemplifies, I think, local history at its best. Rather than focusing only on peaceful social change, Dennis's Lawrence course examines John Brown, William Quantrill, and violence in the town's earliest history. Rather than studying only the merchant class, his course examines the working classes and the lives and the dwellings of these people. And this course, as you know, presents not only white Americans, but also African Americans and Native Americans. And it presents not only Ron Lawrence, but also the people who challenged their leadership. Tip O'Neill, who was at one time Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, said, "All politics is local." And increasingly, I think, historians of the U.S. act on the intellectual premise that all history is local. There's much more that local history can do for us. So much history has been sanitized, has been whitewashed. And I learned this, I think, especially in putting together my remarks about race relations and the quest for equality in Lawrence and at KU. I knew little about racial segregation in Lawrence when I began my inquiry. I'd heard about the lynching of 3 African Americans in 1882, but I really didn't know much about it. I learned, I think, above all in preparing my remarks for this course, but also more importantly, in listening to it and watching it on television, I learned that for local to have any value, it must be honest. And the Lawrence course, which you have taken, has above all, I think, been honest. So I want to thank Dennis Domer, the many contributors to this course, and to the students who so warmly welcomed us. Thank you, and thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, Bill. Beth, do you have some comments that you'd like to bring up?
Dennis has asked me to focus on a particular topic which has permeated in an explicit as well as an implicit way all of your discussions, and that is the topic of identity. Is it possible for you, for us, to say that there is something special or something unique, something particular about Lawrence? Is Lawrence to be distinguished from other Midwestern towns? Is Lawrence to be distinguished because of its particular local history? What, in other words, is Lawrence's identity? The name of this class has been the Biography of a City, and all of the lectures collectively have been a life of Lawrence. Is it possible, therefore, for us to think about Lawrence as a person, Lawrence as an individual, as you would when you are thinking about a biography of an individual? What, in other words, comes to your mind, to our minds, which really differentiates or distinguishes Lawrence? Or is Lawrence simply representative of other collective collections of human beings or other communities in the middle part of this country?
I think that there's an old German phrase that says the teacher learns the most. I think
that might be an old Chinese phrase.
That might be an old Chinese phrase too. I learned it in German, der Lehrer lernt am meisten, from one of my old professors. I think that in this course, what I've learned is how difficult it is for Lawrence to swallow a lot of its history. It repeats itself over and over again, the myths, the way it wants to be seen, rather than what it really is. And I think in order for us to avoid those murderous conflicts that you suggest, that we have to find ways to look at ourselves even when we may not always be admirable. And I think that a very process of looking at ourselves honestly, as Bill Tuttle has said, is the admirable quality that we should all aspire to. I've noticed in my reading of Lawrence history for this course how thinly constructed our history often can be because we insist on repeating the old things. How difficult it was in this class, for example, for us to accept the 60s, even though they're now 30 years away. How tumultuous and how that turned over this course in some ways in terms of how we present ourselves. Yes, I think we are, in many ways daily, a sort of a phoenix out of the ashes. But I want us to look at all the ashes of that past fire and to examine them closely. The thing that I've learned myself in this course is that it's a very complex city. And that, as I said in my introduction, it might be easier to teach the history of Rome because that's been canonized and conventionalized and set up by dozens of scholars. And this is still a scattered conglomeration of 100,000 molecules of knowledge that haven't collected around categories of information as much as we might expect other cities to have done. I've also noticed there's a kind of defensiveness about Lawrence. I think that all cities, certainly my little town, we wanted to defend ourselves. I think Lawrence is the same. Perhaps it's Kansas, perhaps it's simply normal. But we ought to get over our defensiveness. We ought to take a look at ourselves very clearly. We ought to do this over and over again because I think that's what makes us interesting. We have so much to offer if we do that. And I think Lawrence is in the making, certainly. We're going to fight over the South Lawrence Trafficway for quite a while. That's not going to be easy to resolve. It's the most conservative political leadership we've had probably in many years, but right underneath the surface, just barely underneath the surface, is this kind of political boiling point of opposition that is courageous and is outspoken. And even though I think Lawrence in many ways is a developer's paradise, the opposition makes that development eventually better. One of the things I learned from a developer, Bob Billings, in my studies of Albemarle, which I want to continue to do, is that he, the developer, said, I like the outspoken nature of Lawrence. I think that it slows things down. It allows us time to sit back and look at ourselves and to contemplate that future that we all have to build. And in many ways, I think that this course has done that for me. I hope it's done that for the students who have attended. I know that we have a large television audience, and every week new people come up to me and say, I've seen that TV course of yours, and I have this to say about it, or I have that to say about it. But primarily, we've had a chance this semester to look more deeply at our own past, at ourselves, at how we participate in it and can contribute to it. Looking forward to the students' papers. I think that the topics that they have chosen have been right to the point. I've emphasized looking for something new, make some contribution to the history of Lawrence. I don't just want a regurgitation, and there's plenty of that to be done. And when this course is over and done, and when all these students' projects are in, I am confident that Lawrence is complex enough, interesting enough, growing enough, not just in its expanded developmental area, but also in its intellectual and economic and political life, and cultural life particularly, that we will have much to do in the future. And I hope that in 3 or 4 years we can bring this course back.
Give Dennis a big round of applause.
Thank you.
$25 you guys hand in these
I don't know, it's one of my
This
favorites.
is Copperhead, mine's Copperhead.
Yeah, I got a copperhead.
Well, you can imagine that at the turn of about 1885 when they were really popping them up. These guys drink a lot of these. Slugging them down.
In the car, I could go down and do the hospital. It's really, when I was in the States, 30 years ago,
I passed that.
Just do taping session, and then send it out on TV when we're not teaching the class.